Hello, welcome to Sail in Finland, and this is my next video in my series on 8-meter yachts and yachting in anticipation of the World Cup in Turku this year 2025. Actually, I'm now out at sea, and behind me here is Airisto. It's the area where the race is going to happen, and we now have a very typical, very light southwesterly summer breeze. So that's a nice introduction now to today's topic. So that's going to be the wind conditions during the race. So let's see if I can dig out some statistics on wind conditions, and let's see if we can make some kind of estimates what kind of winds to expect during the World Cup. Okay, so welcome back. Now I'm here back at the office. So let's see what we can find out about the wind conditions on Airisto. First, let's take a little bit of an overview of the race area. So here we have the race area, Airisto, or actually the northern part of Airisto. So as you can see, it's a very sheltered, area. There's islands more or less on all sides. There's a little bit of mainland there, and we only have one kind of channel or direction for a little bit more significant wave formation. So if we have wind from here, then yes, there can be a little bit of waves here. But in general, waves will not be your main problem. Also in Finland, there is essentially no tide. The water level does change a little bit, from time to time, but that's more random change based on the weather rather than a sort of a systematic or regular tide. So there's also very little currents even in these rather narrow straits. So current is not either one of your major issues. But then there's actually an interesting little detail here, thanks to Joanna from Foreca, one of the meteorological companies in Finland, for pointing this out to me. So here is Rajakari weather station on this little island here at the southern end of the race area, and Joanna pointed out to me that there's actually historical data stored for the Rajakari. So we actually have very accurate wind information related to the race area. So let's take a look at that information. Okay, so what I did was I actually then fetched wind information for the first 10 days in August for the last 6 years, so from 2019 to 2024. So that's like 60 data points. So let's take a look at that information. I structured it so that I looked at 3 time slots. So I looked at the 11 to 12 time slot, I looked at the 1 to 2 time slot, and then the 3 to 4 time slot. In Finland, wind speed is indicated in meters per second. If your sort of wind speed measure is knots, it's very easy to convert. So you just multiply, the meters per second by 2, and then you have the knots. So here, for instance, we have 4 to 6 meters per second. So that would be the equivalent of 8 to 12 knots in terms of wind. Also, the wind speed is measured at 10 meters above the water. So sort of halfway up an 8-meter mast. And the average wind speed is calculated over periods of 10 minutes. Now, the historical data then has the data in 1 hour blocks. So it means that the average speed here is kind of the average of 6 averages, if you like. So the average of these 6 10-minute time periods. The other 2 things that I then was interested in was gusts, so the maximum gust strength, again over the hour, and then the wind direction. Again, the wind direction has been then averaged over 1 hour, and of course there's going to be small micro variations in the wind direction. So it's not quite as stable, the wind direction, as this data would indicate. So let's take a little bit of look then in more detail at the data. So first here we have the 11 to 12 slot, so that kind of corresponds to the first hour of the first race of the day. So we can see that average wind speeds, the most common wind speed at that point, that time of the day is 4 to 6 meters, or roughly 10 knots. And then we have a couple of days, so here's 3, so 4 days out of 60, when already in the morning, the average wind speed has been over 10 meters per second, which then is the cutoff speed, I guess, for the races. What about then wind direction? So the kind of the dominant wind direction for summer winds in the archipelago tend to be southwesterlies, and that's quite clearly shown here. Actually, I'm a little bit surprised that there are so many wind directions here, slightly to the east of south, but it's perhaps partially also due to the kind of the funneling of wind there, across Airisto. That might have an effect on this thing. The other thing that has been quite common recently is actually then northerlies, so northwest, northeast, which have, at least in my opinion, become more common over the couple of last years. So we can see that there's 9. Well, there's 6, because I always have to add one fake 0 in order to get Excel to make these nice graphs that start at 0. So 16, so 1 in 4 days, you would expect then to have a northerly wind in the morning. And here we can see then how the wind speed is distributed across the wind directions. So here you can see the southwesterly, southeasterly, quite the dominant component here, where we have then a few already quite strong, windy days, and then we have the northerly components here, and we don't have anything here right now in the morning that goes over 10 meters per second. Then the next thing is then gusts. So looking at the maximum gust, and we can see then that, it's gusting a little bit more than the average wind speed. So we have 6 to 8 is the most common speed for gusts. When we have 4 to 6 was sort of the average speed. And then we can see that we have some days when, I would consider, be very gusty wind. So where the gusts already reach, well over 10 meters per second, 20 knots. And then we have this one day here. I can still remember this was a day in 2023, and we were actually holed up quite close to Airisto, and sheltering from the wind here. It was a pretty stormy day. And then we can see that, if we look at the gusts in terms of direction, there's really not much difference, compared to, the average wind speed. So we can see that the one really kind of stormy day with gusts is a little bit easterly. And then otherwise, the gusts are pretty much distributed in the same fashion as the, just the sort of the average wind speed. No big differences there. So next then let's look at the time 1 to 2. So this could be perhaps, around the start or in the middle of the second race. So what's the situation then? So here's now the average wind speed. There hasn't been a very significant change here. We have a little bit, well, we have now 7 days here when the wind speed, and for the second race, the average wind speed is above 10 meters. So that means like 10% of the days. You would perhaps then not have a second race if this wind speed was then already happening when the race would start. And in the wind direction, there's a little bit of evening out here now. The northerlies have perhaps tended a little bit either west or east, and we still have then the southwesterlies as the dominant wind component. But we can see now that the gusts are picking up, so we already have quite a few days when it's gusting pretty heavily. So what will this become? This is 1, 10, 13, 14, 15 days. So one in 4 days when the gusts then will reach well over 20 knots. So here's another way of looking at the gustiness. So you can see that while normally winds are fairly stable, so gusts going between 2 to 3 meters above average speed, and then we have this tail here of really gusty days. And of course these days it might be quite heavy, the gusting. The wind speed in this thing is actually plotted. Now the axis here is actually time. So this is 2019, 2020, 2021, and so on. So we can see that I would argue that there was a small trend here of increasing winds now over the last couple of years. Last year totally broke that trend. So it's interesting to see now then, what will happen in 2025. This is not a prediction for that. This is just giving you some background information. Then, of course, what's interesting then if you're racing is what happens to the wind then during the race. So here we can see then, first of all, the change in wind direction. So positive numbers here are then turning clockwise. So we can see that while perhaps the southwesterlies stay fairly stable, again the Airisto funnel kind of aids a little bit in this. So we can see that this is what I would consider sort of on a nice sunny day. So I would consider this is what would happen. So the winds would start turning a little bit westward from south. While then, if we look at the northerlies, then what happens to them is quite interesting. This one more or less totally changed direction, and then we have perhaps a more even distribution between clockwise and counterclockwise changes here. So you still need to pay quite careful attention to what happens. You can't trust that, the wind change is always going to be clockwise. What happens then to average wind speed? This is the change in wind speed. And we can see that while most days the wind speed is not going to be reduced, so this means that the wind speed, wind is increasing, and then we have a few days where it's actually decreasing. So there's not a lot of decrease in if it is reduced. So typically less than 1 meter per second, while then the increase over the 2 hours can be easily like 2 or 3 meters per second. Okay, so that was then the 1 to 2 slot, and then if we look at the 3 to 4 slot, we can see that actually wind speeds have now in general increased a bit more. So now 6 to 8 meters per second is the most common speed. And also the wind direction has kind of stabilized still in a somewhat westerly direction. So that one again is the anomaly. So essentially in the 0 to 45 degrees angle, there's actually no wind at between 3 and 4, and the easterlies have gone down. So we can see that south and westerlies are very much the dominant thing. So at least don't calculate on getting a wind shift towards this direction in your race strategy. So we can see here this is the wind direction change. So a lot of now quite strong clockwise change. So we can see here a lot of the winds that were a little bit easterly originally, then they have now tended quite a lot, clockwise. So it means that the sort of this easterly quadrant has been a little bit emptied out on wind direction. And here's then just a sort of a summary of the wind speed. So we can see the wind speed distribution here at 11 to 12. So peaking here at roughly 5 meters per second or 4 to 6. And then we can see then that towards the afternoon, then in general, we have a small trend of strengthening winds. Here's actually the same graph, but just a little bit more detail. So same effect there. So slight increase here in the wind speed from 11 to 1, and then perhaps a more significant increase then in the afternoon from 1 to 3 slot. Okay, so that was a little bit of summary of what we could learn about the wind speed. So next, let's then look at a couple of scenarios from hypothetical races and see what this could mean. Actually, I'm using now what is called a topological map. So this map then shows the height of the islands along the Airisto shore. So we can see, for instance, here Lapila. What do we have here? Almost 20 meters above water. The island of Vepsa here, 12 meters. And what do we have in Ruissalo? 17 meters. So this is now the height of the land surrounding Airisto. So what this then means in practice. So let's first think about start with the southwesterly. So normally they don't want to make the race course, in the middle of the sort of this main fairway. So let's assume that the race course would be something like this. So start is here, and then the downwind mark, something like this. And we would have a regular day with sort of southwesterly winds, something like this. So how does the wind perhaps then behave now with respect to the islands? So we know that there's a little bit of diffraction. So a little bit of wind going here, a little bit wind turning here around these islands, a little bit turning here. Normally, I guess you wouldn't go this far here. So and then here it's a bit more interesting. So what would happen here in this thing? So normally the wind then gets a little bit more off the straight off the shore here. Of course, we would have wind shadow here from the islands. These are quite high actually. So again, when you're racing here, the wind direction is not going to be totally stable, but it will change then a little bit between, with the gust, but it will also change then a little bit due to the influence of the islands, which are quite close then to the race course. Okay, so that's the southerly case. So let's take another case. So what if there's a northerly wind? So then probably the race course might look something like this. I don't know, let's assume this. And we would have the wind coming here. So what happens here now? That's of interest. Well, first of all, we have this channel here, which is surrounded by actually quite high islands. So there's probably going to be a little bit of tunnel effect here. So the wind down this way will probably have a slightly different wind angle from this one. So, and then, it might kind of a little bit turn around here like this. Also, of course, there's going to be quite significant wind shadow in this area here due to the island. Also, then let's think about a situation where we start off perhaps a little bit more like this. So now the wind will be blowing like this. So again, we have a slightly the same effect here, but in reverse. So if this is the dominant wind direction, then still here is going to be a little bit, perhaps more, slightly different angle of the wind. Again, wind shadow here. And perhaps a little bit like tendency to go like this here. So again, the closer you are to shore, the more you can expect the wind to be impacted, of course, by the shores and this sort of diffraction thing. Of course, in this situation, you hardly have any waves because there's really not a significant fetch for waves anywhere here. So this is going to be quite calm waters, while, of course, if you are coming from, if the wind is southwest, then there's a little bit longer fetch. So a strong southwesterly is going to generate a little bit more waves than in this area. But of course, again, the waves are going to be diffracting, in that sense as well. But hey, this was what I found out. Hope you found this useful. And if you did, then perhaps, give Sail in Finland on YouTube a follow, because this is, there's going to be hopefully some more 8-meter stuff when we get to August and the actual races. So see you in the next video.